Hello and welcome back. In the previous episode, where I was telling you the story of Operation Gibraltar, we had covered up to what happened in middle of August 1965. Just to recap, by the middle of August 1965, Pakistan's Op Gibraltar was no longer an invisible campaign of stealth. In the first week, infiltrators had crossed the ceasefire line in groups, some small, some fairly large, slipping through gullies, mountain tracks, and forest paths. They carried mortars, light machine guns, wireless sets, and supplies for weeks. On paper, it looked like a master plan. 10 forces, the details of which have been covered in the previous episode, fanned out across the valley and Jammu region, sparking revolt and tying down Indian troops. But the situation had shifted quickly. Villagers had noticed strangers in their midst, speaking in accent from Mirpur or Kotli rather than local Kashmiri. Farmers like Muhammad Deen, whose story I had covered in the previous episode, had reported them. Army patrols had begun clashing with them in forest and ravines. Weapons and maps captured from early prisoners revealed the scale of the attempt. By 9th August, when Pakistan had hoped that Srinagar would erupt in revolt during the Pir Dastagir Sahib festival and Sheikh Abdullah's arrest anniversary, nothing of that sort happened. The crowds dispersed quietly, watched over by newly flown in Gurkhas and Sikh allied troops. The infiltrators found no support. Now, instead of silent infiltration, the campaign turned into open fighting. This was a crucial turning point. Pakistan had expected to control the pace of operation, choosing the time and place of action. But with surprise lost, they were forced into skirmishes on Indian terms. From Kupwara in the north to Rajouri in the south, infiltrator groups tried to keep moving, to cut roads, to harass convoys, to set fire to towns and shops. Indian units responded with patrols, ambushes, and reinforcement of vulnerable points. State armed police and civil militia joined in, often guided by local villagers. The result was a grind, day after day of small clashes, with neither side able to deliver a decisive blow, but with the balance slowly shifting towards India. This was the character of war in Kashmir in mid August 1965. No longer an uprising, no longer a plan in neat columns, but a messy, grinding struggle in which every patrol, every convoy, and every bridge became important. 13th August 1965 was one of the hardest blows suffered by the Indian Army during Operation Gibraltar. It showed both the dangers of poor ground selection and resilience of soldiers when struck hard. 8th Kumaon had deployed its tactical headquarters at a small forest rest house near Naugam. On the map, it seemed convenient, close to road communication and in a sheltered depression. But tactically, it was a poor choice. The rest house sat in low ground, ringed by slopes on three sides. Any enemy with the will and strength to attack could dominate it with fire. In counter infiltration operations, where the enemy was scattered and elusive, such a location was especially risky. At dawn on 13th August, infiltrators took advantage of this weakness. They had been gathering in the forest through the night, and in the first light, they opened fire with mortars and rockets. Shells crashed into the rest house compound, shaking men awake and throwing the camp into confusion. Before defenses could settle, the raiders charged down the slopes. The infiltrators had one advantage: they were not village mobs. Many were trained regulars, including men from Pakistan's Special Service Group. They came with automatic weapons and grenades, and they pressed their attack with determination. Within minutes, they had broken into the perimeter. What followed was savage close fighting. Grenades were hurled into rooms and corridors. Automatic fire rattled at close range. Men fought in small knots, sometimes hand to hand. In the confusion, Lieutenant Colonel M.V. Gore, the commanding officer of 8 Kumaon, was killed. Alongside him, 15 men of the battalion fell. Major Gopal Singh, the second in command, was badly wounded. The shock of losing the CO is unlike any other in a battalion. A battalion is not just numbers on paper, it is a living community, and the CO is its pivot. His fall creates silence, confusion, and grief. At Naugam, for a time, the unit was in danger of being overrun. Yet, what made the difference was the instinct of Indian soldiers to hold ground. Small detachments of Kumaunis held out in scattered corners of the camp. They kept returning fire, stopping the infiltrators from taking full control. Signals went out through field sets. Reinforcements were ordered forward. Help arrived in the form of armor and infantry. Tanks from Central India Horse pushed through, firing into the forest edges. Troops from Sikh regiment moved up alongside. Together, they broke through the cordon around the camp and forced the infiltrators back up the slopes. By midday, the position was stabilized. The prize, however, was heavy. The battalion had lost its CO, 15 soldiers, and several others were wounded. It was a wound that went beyond numbers. For the Kumaon regiment, Naugam remained a painful memory of a hard lesson. Never cite a headquarters in ground that can be dominated, and never underestimate the enemy's ability to mass strength suddenly. The action also showed the resilience of disciplined troops. Even when leaderless and surrounded, 8 Kumaun's soldiers held out long enough for reinforcement to arrive. The stubborn resistance prevented the enemy from capturing the headquarters and turning a sure shot defeat into victory. In hindsight, Naugam underlined two truths of military: choose good ground and secure your command post. You can never ignore it. Second, morale and cohesion can carry a unit through even when leadership is suddenly cut down. Another place which is of importance is Khag, which was a trap for 6 Rajput. If Naugam showed the danger of poor ground selection, the incident at Khag near Naugam revealed the risks of misplaced trust and cruelty of irregular warfare. It was one of those small unit actions that left deep scars on the men who lived through it. The story began with information. Two men from village Khag, presented as respected eminent persons, approached the headquarters of 6 Rajput. They claimed that infiltrators had been seen in the area. In a campaign like Gibraltar, where the enemy moved in small groups and depended on local guides, every such report was important. Villagers had already provided useful leads elsewhere, and the army could not afford to ignore warnings. Lieutenant Colonel Mustasad Ahmed, commanding officer of 6 Rajput, decided to verify the report personally. Taking a small party that included his young intelligence officer, Lieutenant Manjeet Singh Bhasin, he moved towards the suspected location. The decision reflected both professional caution and personal courage. SEO rarely leads such patrols himself, but in an atmosphere where infiltration reports poured in daily, Ahmed chose to see for himself. The patrol moved out into the fields near Khag. It was here that the trap was sprung. Infiltrators, already positioned in cover, opened fire from multiple directions. Automatic weapons rattled. The patrol was caught in the open, with little cover to fall back on. In that moment, individual character showed. Lieutenant Manjeet Singh Bhasin, barely in his 20s, stood up to the fire back, exposing himself repeatedly to give covering fire. His CEO tried to pull him down, urging him to stay low. Bhasin's reply was remembered by all who heard it. The bullet with my name has not yet been made. Seconds later, he was hit through the eye and collapsed into his commander's arms. The small party fought as best it could under heavy fire. Some were wounded, others killed. With no hope of holding out in the open, Ahmed ordered withdrawal. The Rajputs carried their wounded but were forced to leave behind the bodies of their fallen comrades. It was one of the hardest decisions for soldiers to leave comrades in enemy held ground. The next morning, when a larger force returned to the spot, they found the bodies mutilated. The infiltrators had committed acts of cruelty intended to terrify and demoralize. In military history, such acts often produce the opposite effect. At Khag, they did not spread fear, they created resolve. Soldiers who saw their comrades dishonored swore to fight harder, not to falter. The incident at Khag was significant for several reasons. It exposed the danger of relying on unverified intelligence from local informants, however respectable they might appear. It showed the enemy's willingness to use deception and brutality. And it revealed the resilience of a battalion that absorbed a painful blow yet refused to be cowed down. The loss of young officer like Basim also carried symbolic weight. His words, spoken in the heat of action, became part of regimental memory. For the Rajputs, Khag was not just another skirmish. It was a moment that stiffened their pride and determination. If Naugam was bitter and Khag was brutal, Bimberg Gali provided a story of grit that lifted morale. It was not a grand battle, but a sharp action led by a JCO that saved lives and ammunition at a critical moment. The scene was the narrow Bimberg Gali road, a lifeline connecting Rajouri and Punch. On this twisting mountain road, three Indian Army trucks loaded with ammunition were making their way. These were not just vehicles, they carried the lifeblood of a division, rounds for their rifles, mortars, and machine guns. Without them, the units in the forward area would be starved of firepower. Pakistani raiders ambushed the convoy. They had chosen their ground well, lying in wait at a bend where the road narrowed and vehicles slowed. The infiltrators fire, killing drivers and forcing the trucks. The next step was clear. They intended to blow up the trucks and deny the Indian Army its ammunition. In the logic of infiltration warfare, such an action would cripple Indian responses. At this moment, Subedar Duli Chand of 14 Jat arrived with his platoon. Hearing the gunfire, he moved quickly to the spot. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or trying to assess numbers, he led a direct charge. His men rushed forward, firing and shouting, catching the infiltrators by surprise. There was fierce close range fighting. But the raiders, realizing they had lost the chance to ignite the ammunition trucks, broke contact and scattered into the surrounding hills. When the smoke cleared, the trucks were intact. Inside, four drivers who had been trapped were pulled out alive, though badly wounded. The ammunition, tons of it, was saved. A single platoon acting decisively under the resolute Casio had prevented what could have been a major logistical disaster. The action at Bimberg Gali is a reminder that in a war, not every battle is won by big formations or famous generals. Sometimes a single platoon makes the difference. Infiltration warfare thrives on attacking lifelines. Protecting them demands alertness, courage, and the ability to seize the moment. Let's explain the importance of lines of communication in detail. You may be asked this question, or you can use the content in while answering some other questions. In mountains, supply routes are as important as guns in the field. Roads, bridges, and convoys are constant targets for infiltrators. If supply lines break, even the strongest battalion cannot hold its ground. Protecting these lifelines is therefore as vital as fighting on the front lines. The Bimber Gali showed how small unit leadership can protect a strategic artery. Let's now correlate these incidents with what Arthashastra says. Kautilya wrote that an army must guard its sources of strength, food, money, and supplies. He warned that enemies would always strike at the grain and the storehouse before challenging the army directly. Operation Gibraltar was a living example of this principle. The infiltrators knew they could not fight Indian units head on, so they stuck at convoys and dumps. But where soldiers like Dulichand stood firm, the enemy's plan collapsed. The victory at Bimber Gali was more than physical. It gave hurt to units across the sector. Word spread quickly that ammunition had been saved and infiltrators beaten back. After the losses at Naugam and Khag, this small win studied nerves and reminded everyone that grit could blunt infiltration, artillery fire, and civilian suffering. By now, the clash with infiltrators was no longer limited to small skirmishes in valleys and villages. The Pakistan army itself had stepped up openly. Artillery began pounding Indian positions across the ceasefire line. What had started as an infiltration plan was now a campaign backed by artillery guns. At Punch, shells rained on the town and surrounding posts. Civilians watched as homes caught fire and shops crumbled. For them, the war was no longer a distant rumor. It had entered their lives. At Rajouri, brigade headquarters was shelled with accuracy, showing that Pakistani forward observers were guiding the guns. At Jodia, Indian engineers of 369 Field Company were hit by concentrated fire. They lost men, vehicle, and stores. What was meant to be a rear area unit was suddenly fighting for survival. This was a critical shift. The infiltrators had never been alone. They had been supported from across the border with supplies and instructions. By the entry of Pakistani artillery meant the mask had slipped. The campaign could no longer be denied as a people's uprising. It was clear Pakistan's regular army was backing the operation. For the Indian army, this created two challenges. The first was tactical. Units had to fight infiltrators in front and endure shelling from across the line at the same time. The second was political. India had to expose Pakistan's duplicity to the world. On the ground, however, the men did what soldiers always do: dug deeper, spread out, and fight back. Amid this, ordinary villagers bore the heaviest burden. In the valley, arson attacks were carried out by infiltrators. Buses were burned, time bombs were planted in marketplace, and panic was spread deliberately. In Rajouri and Punch, civilians ran to the army for protection. Far from joining the infiltrator, most villagers now became informers, pointing out strangers, guiding patrols, and helping ambushes. Let's let's understand it in a military term. Artillery is called the god of war. Its shells kill, but they also spread fear. In infiltration warfare, artillery is used not only to destroy but also to unsettle morale, to show that raiders are not alone. Yet, this use of artillery exposed Pakistan's hand. Instead of inspiring revolt, it convinced many Kashmiris that they were in the middle of an invasion, not a liberation. Let's look at what does Arthashastra say. Kautilya had cautioned rulers about the treatment of local populations during war. He wrote that people, when harmed, will turn against even their own king. The infiltrators violated this principle. By burning shops and attacking buses, they harmed the very people they claimed to liberate. The result was predictable. Villagers sided with the Indian state. What was meant to be a terror became the reason for resistance. This was perhaps the deepest flaw in Operation Gibraltar. Without popular support, infiltration becomes only an external raid, and no raid, however daring, can succeed if the people do not provide cover and sustenance. The turning point. By the second week of August, the pattern was clear to Indian commanders. Infiltrators were slipping through gaps, striking convoys, attacking posts, and disappearing into the forest. Pakistani artillery was pounding from across the ceasefire line. If India remained defensive, the enemy would always choose the place and time to hit. The initiative was slipping. General Harbakh Singh, Western Army commander, recognized this. He pressed Chief of the Army Staff, General J.N. Chaudhary, with a blunt assessment. As long as we remain on our side, it will be a war of attrition. We will bleed slowly. To stop this, we must go across. This was not rhetoric. It was sound military logic. In mountains, cutting enemy routes and destroying his bases is the only way to choke infiltration. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri, cautious by nature, had avoided escalation until now. But the losses at Naugam, the brutality at Khag, and constant shelling had made the situation urgent. On 13th August, General Chaudhary met Prime Minister Shastri and laid out the stark choice: either continue to absorb endless raids or take the fight into occupied territory. Shastri gave his consent. The decision changed the character of the conflict. Indian forces were no longer just defending villages and convoys. They would now aim to recapture key passes and ridges used by infiltrators, routes like Hajipir and Kishanganga, which connected Pakistani staging areas with the valley. Once these were blocked, Gibraltar's lifeline would be cut. Explaining the military way, in any campaign, the side that chooses the battlefield holds the advantage. Till mid August, infiltrators had dictated terms. By deciding to go across the ceasefire line, India took back initiative. It was a risky step. Escalation could lead to full-scale war, but it was the only way to break the cycle of raids. Arthashastra says, when attacked by hidden enemies, a king must not only guard his walls but also strike at the enemy's base. He also observed that an enemy harassed at his source will no longer have the strength to go for a raid. The Indian decision to go for Hajipir reflected this ancient principle. It was not enough to plug gaps. The roots of infiltration had to be destroyed. In the next episode, we will cover the battle for Hajipir undertaken by one para. Now let's look at why did Operation Gibraltar collapse. By the third week of August 1965, Pakistan's grand gamble was falling apart. What had been planned as a swift uprising in Kashmir had become a series of scattered firefights, failed ambushes, and heavy losses to the infiltrators. The infiltrators were not welcomed by the locals as their liberators. They were strangers and were being hunted. The reason for collapse were clear on the ground. First, the local population did not rise. This was the central flaw. Pakistan's plan assumed that Kashmiris would join the infiltrators, swelling their ranks and turning raids into rebellion. But the people did not. Instead, villagers reported strangers pointed out camps and in many cases guided Indian patrol. The infiltrators were outsiders speaking different dialect, often heavy-handed and most of the time brutal. Far from inspiring loyalty, they provoked suspicion. Secondly, the element of surprise had been lost early. The very first encounters in Tangmar, Titwal and Rajouri exposed the scale of infiltration. Prisoners were captured, weapons were seized, and villagers confirmed unusual movements. By the time of the planned big uprising on 9th August in Srinagar, Indian reinforcements were already in place. The Gurkhas guarded the airfield, Secrecy secured Badami Bagh, and militia units stiffened checkpoints. Instead of slipping into an undefended city, infiltrators walked into fortress. The third reason was the grit shown by the Indian Army. Units surprised at Naugam and Khag fought back. At Bimberg Gali, a single platoon saved trucks of ammunition. At Trigam, Kumaunis stood firm even after heavy losses. In sector after sector, small unit actions proved decisive. Pakistan had gambled that its raider would create panic. Instead, Indian battalion absorbed the shocks and struck back. The fourth reason was the civil administration did not break. Chief Minister G.M. Sadiq kept the state machinery running. Martial law was not declared. This was important. By keeping governance visible, Delhi ensured that infiltrators could not claim legitimacy. Pakistan had hoped that chaos would allow them to set up a revolutionary council. Instead, civil order, though strained, continued. Finally, India went on offensive. Once Shastri approved cross-border strikes, Gibraltar's fate was sealed. Without safe bases in POK, infiltrators were cut off, starved of supplies, and hunted down. Operations to capture Hajipir and Kishanganga closed their main routes. What had begun as infiltration ended as retreat. By late August, the infiltrators were either dead, captured, or slipped back across the ceasefire line. Thousands were lost. Weapons and radios were seized in large numbers. The dream of a popular revolt had ended in silence. Instead of triumph, Pakistan was left exposed as the architect of a failed adventure. Let's look at it from the military point of view. Gibraltar failed because it broke the two iron rules of infiltration: secrecy and support. Without secrecy, movements are exposed. Without support, infiltrators are isolated. Pakistan lost both. Once villagers refused to cooperate and Indian troops adapted, Gibraltar was doomed. Kautilya had warned, a reckless campaign without allies among the people leads a king to ruin. His words fit Gibraltar perfectly. The plan depended on people's support, but none came. Instead, Pakistan was left fighting alone, its mask torn off, its forces bleeding in hostile ground. What was the aftermath? For India, Gibraltar's failure was only half a victory. Yes, the infiltrators had been defeated, but the shadow of escalation was already visible. Pakistan could not accept such humiliation. Zulfikar Bhutto and the generals prepared their next move, Operation Grand Slam, a direct strike with tanks in Cham. Thus, the collapse of Gibraltar did not end the crisis. It became the bridge to the larger war of September 1965. In the upcoming episode, we will cover this detail, the story of Grand Slam also. But prior to that, I will cover the operations across into Hajipir from two directions, Uri and Punch. Till then, keep working hard. You're requested to please like, share, and comment. Jai Hind.